Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video we're going to be discussing each and every Eastern Conference signings for the day one of free agent frenzy. We'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here at the Intent Hockey channel. Now, as we talked about a little while ago in my previous video, I'm going to be kicking off the Eastern Conference Day 1 signings. So, as we know, Day 1 was a really busy day in the NHL. There were a lot of signings that happened, over 160. So, we're already got through all of the Western Conference teams and who they brought in Day 1 of the free agent frenzy. We're going to talk about all the Eastern Conference teams now and who they brought in on Day 1 of free agent frenzy. So, we'll go into alphabetical order, and we'll go with the Atlantic Division first. So we'll start with the Boston Bruins, and they made a ton of signings on day one of free agent frenzy. Most of them were lower end signings, but we'll get to all of them here. So the defensive end, they signed two guys, Parker Wotherspoon to a 1-year league minimum deal, as well as Kevin Shattenkirk to a 1-year deal with the AAV of $1.05 million. So some pretty good depth signings there, but they moved a lot of players on the forward group. They signed Anthony Richard to a 1-year league minimum deal. They signed Jason Megna to a 1-year league minimum deal. They signed Morgan Geekie to a 2-year deal with an AAV of $2 million. They signed Toporowski, who was a guy who signed his entry-level contract, to a 2-year deal with an AAV of $870,000. They signed forward Patrick Brown to a 2-year deal with an AAV of $800,000. And then they signed Milan Lucic and James Reimsdyk, both to matching 1-year, $1 million deals. So on the defensive end, Shattenkirk, solid defensive player. We know they already got some defensive depth. I do wonder what this means for guys like Grzelcyk or Forbort, but Shattenkirk should be a solid third-pair defenseman on a team in Boston who's looking to still compete for the Cup. As for Wotherspoon, I would expect him to most likely be AHL defenseman, maybe get some time in the NHL if there was enough injuries, but for the most part, I think Wotherspoon will be a good AHL depth player for the Bruins. But on the forward group, tons of good additions there. Anthony Richard and Jason Megna, I would say both are most likely going to be in the AHL, but should easily be some of the first call-ups for the Bruins, and should easily be able to get into the lineup. You've also got Geekie, Brown, Lucic. Those three are all going to be fitting in really well in the bottom six. When the Bruins lost a couple of pieces, Lucic can be a solid fourth-line forward, as can Patrick Brown. Geekie I could even see being on the third line, so some pretty good solid bottom six forwards there. Then you've also got James Reimsdyk, who should be able to fit in the middle six on the forward group, maybe even on the left wing with a guy like David Pastrnak. So some really good additions there. They improved their forward group with the additions of Lucic, Geekie, Brown, and James Reimsdyk, including some depth with guys like Megna and Richard. They also got some defensive depth with Wotherspoon, and they got a good third pair defenseman in Shattenkirk. So some really good additions there on the defensive end and forward group for the Bruins on day one of free agent frenzy. Talking on the Buffalo Sabres next on day one, they did a pretty good amount of signings too. So they brought in two goalies, both on 1-year league minimum deals, and Devin Cooley and Dustin Tokarski. They also brought back forward Tyson Jost on a 1-year, $2 million deal. They brought in Justin Richards on a 1-year league minimum deal, and then they signed a couple of defensemen, Connor Clifton on a 3-year, $3.33 million deal, and Eric Johnson on a 1-year, $3.25 million deal. So Clifton, Johnson, both really good third-pair defensemen. Not sure if either of them will be able to improve that top four, which I said they really needed to do, but they're really good depth defensemen. I could see them both be on like the third pair, in my opinion. They've also got a little bit more defensive depth. We know that they're most likely going to try and trade Comrie at the very least, and there's still some options that they could possibly try and upgrade in the net. So Cooley, Tokarski, I think could both be like the third and fourth stringer if they were to move Comrie. They can basically replace a guy like Malcolm Subban, so some really good depth additions there. And if they do wind up trading Comrie and they're into injuries, I could see a guy like Tokarski get into the NHL for a little bit at least. Jost brought back, he was with the Sabres last year, he's a solid fourth-line center, so a really good addition there for the Sabres to continue to keep guys like Opozo, Girgensons, and now Jost around. And then they also got Richards, who was can probably most likely be a AHL forward, but could, I think, be called up if there were enough injuries. So a good depth addition on the forward group in Richards, a good bring back in Jost, who can be a fourth-line center, some good third-pair defensemen in Clifton and in Johnson, and then they get a couple of good depth goalies in Cooley and Tokarski. So some really good additions there for the Sabres. The Red Wings were quite a busy team day one of free agent frenzy. Really, really busy. On the goaltending side, we know that they lost a couple of guys in Nedeljkovic and Hellberg. They brought in guys like Reimer and Lyon On the goaltending side, Reimer on a 1-year, $1.5 million deal. Lyon on a 2-year deal with the AAV of $900,000. On the defensive end, they brought in Shane Gostisbehere, 1-year deal, $4.125 million. They signed Brogan Rafferty, a 2-year league minimum deal. They signed Justin Holm, a 3-year deal with the AAV of $3.4 million. And they also brought in Gustav Lindstrom on a 1-year, $950,000 deal. So that was our 4 good defensive signings. They also signed on the forward group JT Compher to a 5-year deal with the AAV of $5.1 million. They also signed Clem Costin to a 2-year deal with the AAV of $2 million. They signed Tim Gettinger to a 1-year league minimum deal. And they signed Daniel Sprong to a 1-year, $2 million deal. And then they signed Matt Luff to a 1-year deal at league minimum as well. So a lot of key signings here for the Wings. So we know they lost their goalies. Reimer will most likely be spark a tandem with Husso next year, so the Wings will most likely have a Reimer-Husso tandem. Lyon should be a solid third-string goalie there too, so I think it's a really good addition there on the goaltending side. On the defensive end, Rafferty will most likely be in the AHL. Maybe it could be a call-up option, but most likely will be an AHL defender. After losing Ronick, I said they need a top 4 defenseman. Gostisbehere does that. He's a really good offensive defenseman. 1-year deal should easily be able to help them on the defensive end. Hole, Lindstrom should both be able to challenge for like third pair roles on that team. So some really good signings there. Not a fan of the whole contract, but still, they get a couple of good third pair defensemen, a top 4 defenseman, and a depth defenseman. So some really good signings there for the Wings. And then on the forward group, they once again improved that team. Gettinger, Luff, I'll most likely say are both AHL forwards next year with chances to be called up. You've also got Daniel Sprong, who I think should be a solid bottom 6 forward there. You've got Clem Costin, who I think should be a bottom 6 forward there. And you've got Compher, who I think should fit in really well in the middle 6. So they signed really good players. They signed Luff and Gettinger, who are good depth players. They signed Costin and Sprong, who should be good bottom 6 players. And the Compher, who should be a good middle 6 forward. So some really good additions there. They signed middle 6 forward in Compher, bottom 6 forwards in Costin and Sprong. They also signed depth forwards in Gettinger and Luff. They signed top 4 defenseman Gostisbehere, third pair defenseman Hole and Lindstrom, and depth defenseman Brogan Rafferty. And then they also bring in Reimer, who's a good tandem goalie for the Wings, and they bring in Lyon, who should be a solid third stringer. So in my opinion, that's a really good moves there on day 1 of free agent frenzy for the Wings. The Panthers on day 1, they were pretty busy too. They bring in goalie Anthony Stolarz on a 1-year, $1.1 million deal. They bring in a couple of defensemen, Lucas Carlson back on a 1-year league minimum deal. They signed Oliver Ekman Larsson on a 1-year, $2.25 million deal. They signed Nico Mikkola on a 3-year deal with the AAV of $2.5 million. They bring in Mike Riley on a 1-year, $1 million deal. On the forward group, they re-signed Gregory Denisenko to a 2-year league minimum deal. They signed Alex True to a 1-year league minimum deal. And they signed Kevin Stillen to a 1-year, $1 million deal. So on the goalie side, we know there's still some uncertainty surrounding Spencer Knight. They lost Alex Lyon. They needed a backup at least for a start of the season. Anthony Stolarz should be able to do that. I think if Knight were to come back at some point next year, Stolarz will most likely be a third stringer, but for the time being, he could easily be backup for the Panthers. On the defensive end, Carlson will most likely be a depth player at the AHL level for Florida. Could be a call-up option, but will most likely be there. But as we know, guys like Ekblad and Montour are going to be injured this start of the season, so Ekman Larsson should be a solid top 4 defenseman at the start of the season, while Kuliakov and Riley should both be good depth defensemen, third pair players. So I think those are really good additions. Oliver Ekman Larsson should fill in a role in the top 4. Riley and Kuliakov should both be good third pair defensemen, maybe even playing a little bit higher in the lineup. And they get a good depth defenseman in Lucas Carlson. So some really good signings there. On the forward group, not overly abundance of additions. Denisenko, 2-year league minimum deal, re-signs with the Panthers. It's a really good deal. In fact, I think Denisenko is still a solid middle 6 forward. They also bring in Alex True, I think should be AHL forward, maybe a call-up, but most likely AHL forward. And Kevin Stenlund, who I think after some of their departures should be a solid bottom 6 forward for the Panthers. So that's a really good deal for the Panthers on day 1 of free agent frenzy. For Montreal Canadiens, not anything significant. They bring in forward Philippe Millette on a 1-year league minimum deal, and they bring in defenseman Brady Keeper on a 1-year league minimum deal, and both guys most likely going to be AHL forwards with a chance of being called up if there's some injuries. We know the Canadiens have had a lot of injury troubles, but for the most part, I think both these guys will be AHL players. So the Canadiens were quite quiet, and I think both Canadian teams will be bottom-end players at the AHL level for their roster that they brought in on day 1. Going with the Ottawa Senators, really good day for them. Mostly did do some depth work. They did bring in goalie Korpisalo on a 5-year deal with the AAV of $4 million. They brought in rookie charterer Josh Curry, Matthew Highmore, and Borjan Imama. All four, they brought on a 1-year league minimum deals. They also brought in defenseman Jacob Bednar-Docker, re-signing him to a 2-year $805,000 deal, and signing Eric Brandstrom to a 1-year deal with the AAV of $2 million. So for the defensemen, they were already both keeping them. They were both RFAs. Bednar-Docker should be a good third-pair defenseman, as should Brandstrom this year. I'll be quite surprised if either of them weren't. Korpisalo signing, I think, is a little bit risky with how long-term it is, but he's a really good goalie. He showed that with LA last year. He should be the 1A next year, with Forsberg being the 1B. On the forward group, most of those guys will most likely not be NHL forwards. I think all four of them could easily be AHL forwards. Curry, Charterer, Highmore, Imama, all more basically for AHL forwards. I could see guys like Highmore and Imama maybe getting a call up at the NHL level, but for the most part, I think all four of those guys are most likely just some depth to the team. So some good depth forward signings to improve their depth on the forward group, some good defensive signings to bring back a couple of young defensemen, and then you also get a good starting goalie in Korpisalo. So some really good additions there for the Senators. As for the Tampa Bay Lightning, they had a pretty busy first day. They signed goalie Jonas Johansson to a 2-year deal with the league minimum deal. They also signed forwards Josh Archibald to a 2-year deal with the AAV of $800,000, Luke Glendening to a 2-year deal with the AAV of $800,000, Mitchell Chaffee to a 1-year league minimum deal, Logan Brown to a 1-year league minimum deal, and Connor Sheary to a 3-year deal with the AAV of $2 million. So on the goaltending side, we know they lost Brian Elliott. They're most likely going to have a battle between some of their internal candidates for the backup role. Johansson should definitely be another guy who gets consideration. Decent third stringer, could be a backup to a guy like Vasilevsky, so we'll have to wait and see. On the forward group, Chaffee, I think, should definitely be like an AHL player. Most likely won't get a chance to NHL level. Could be a call-up, but most likely be an AHL forward. Brown, Glendening, and Archibald, I think, all should have a chance of being like solid bottom six forwards. Brown's a good fourth-line center. Glendening's a good fourth-line winger, as is Archibald. So I think all three of those guys should definitely have a chance of being solid bottom six forwards for the Bolts. As for Sheary, he should be a solid middle six forward. He showed he could be a really good point producer last year. He could probably try and fill in a role with a guy like Ross Colton from last year. So some good additions there for the Bolts. Sheary, I think, should definitely be a solid middle six forward. Maybe playing with guys like Stamkos. Then Glendening, Archibald, Brown should be good bottom six forwards. Chaffee should be an AHL player, and then Johansson should contend for the backup role in Tampa. So some really good additions there day one for Tampa. Going over to the Toronto Maple Leafs, they did a couple of really good things on free agent day 2. They signed Artur Akatimov to a 3-year ELC with an AAV of $851,000, so that was a decent signing there. They signed 3 depth defensemen, Marshall Rifey to a 2-year league minimum deal. They signed William Lagesson to a 1-year league minimum deal. They signed Maximum Lajoie to a 1-year league minimum deal. They also signed defenseman John Klingberg to a 1-year deal with an AAV of $4.15 million. And then they signed Ryan Reeves to a 3-year deal with an AAV of $1.35 million. So on the goaltending side, Akatimov will most likely be a AHL player, most likely like the 4th stringer in there. So good to see him get his ELC, but he most likely won't be a good NHL player next year. As for Lajoie, Lagesson, Rifey, all are most likely going to be AHL defensemen for the Leafs. I could see them possibly being called up if they needed it, but I would expect them most to be AHL players for the Leafs, but could be call-ups eventually. Klingberg should definitely be fitting in that top 4. I think he should easily replace a guy like Luke Schenn in the lineup. It's a 1-year deal, so it's not overly expensive, and I think it's a really good addition for the Leafs, so good job for them to get that done. And then Ryan Reeves is a solid bottom 6 forward who should definitely bring some more physicality into that lineup. So they get a solid bottom 6 forward in Reeves, who should definitely be a really good physical and presence and bring the Leafs into the games during the regular season. They got a good top 4 defenseman, John Klingberg, who could definitely be a good offensive player. They also got good depth defenseman in Rifey, Lagesson, and Lajoie, who should start in the AHL next year. And then they also signed Akatimov to a 3-year ELC. So some pretty good signs there for the Leafs. Now we transfer over to the Metro Division, and we'll start with the Carolina Hurricanes. The Hurricanes did make only a couple of signings, but they were big signings. They brought back both their goaltenders. They signed Antti Ranta on a 1-year, $1.5 million deal, and Frederik Andersen on a 2-year deal with the AAV of $3.4 million. They also brought in Michael Bunting on the forward group on a 3-year deal with the AAV of $4.5 million. They brought back Jesper Fast in the forward group to a 2-year deal with the AAV of $2.4 million. And then they signed Dmitry Orlov on the defensive end to a 2-year deal with the AAV of $7.75 million. So, in my eyes, those are some pretty good signings for the Canes. They bring back Anderson and Ranta, who are really good tandem goaltenders for the Canes this year. With Kochetkov as well, I think that should be a solid 1-2-3 punch in the goaltending core. So, some really good additions there for the Carolina Hurricanes. On the forward group, you got Jesper Fast, who should continue to be a really good middle six forward for the Hurricanes, most likely playing on the third line. Bunting should definitely be in the middle six as well and help them with a little bit more depth scoring, and I think he could definitely be a good maybe second line forward for them. As for Orlov, he should definitely improve that team. They still have 4 really good defensemen in Pesce, Shea, Slavin, and Burns, so I do wonder if Orlov maybe bumps one of those guys down to the third line, but that's a really good addition, especially if they do try and trade a guy like Brett Pesce. So some really good additions there for the Hurricanes, signing a top 4 defenseman in Orlov, signing 2 key tandem goalies in Anderson and Ranta, as well as signing a couple of good middle six forwards in Bunting and Fast. So they did really well and they won in free agent frenzy. They won for the Columbus Blue Jackets was relatively quiet. The only signing they made was that they signed 3rd overall pick Adam Fantilli from this past year's draft to a 3-year, $950,000 AAV entry-level contract. So we know that with Fantilli now signed, he's going to turn pro. He's not going back to Michigan, and he will be able to play either with the Columbus Blue Jackets or in the AHL with their affiliates. So I would expect Fantilli to most likely play in the NHL, maybe as like the second-line center for the Jackets. So it's a solid addition there. Once again, not active in free agency, but they're able to get one of their star prospects locked up over the next couple of seasons on an entry-level contract. With the New Jersey Devils, they did make a couple of signings. They brought in goalie Eric Källgren on a 1-year league minimum deal. They brought in a couple of forwards. Justin Dowling, 2-year league minimum deal. Kyle Crisculio, 1-year league minimum deal. They brought back Michael McLeod on a 1-year deal with the AAV of $1.4 million. And they brought back Nathan Bastian on a 2-year deal with the AAV of $1.35 million. So, in my opinion, those are some really good signings. Dowling and Crisculio should both be AHL forwards. Possible call-up candidates, but I would say mostly would be AHL forwards. McLeod and Bastian should be mostly solid bottom 6 forwards again this year. McLeod is the second and third line center. Bastian most likely as a 4th line winger. So some really good signings there for the Devils. Källgren, they still have some pretty good depth in that position, but I do think Källgren could definitely challenge for like the 3rd string role with a guy like Nico Dawes. So definitely, I think that's a really good addition there on the goalie group as well, as Källgren does have some NHL experience. So Källgren, really good depth addition in net. Bringing back McLeod and Bastian should really help that bottom 6, and then get some depth additions with Dowling and Crisculio. So some really good moves there from the Devils on day 1. The Islanders, once again, not an overly active team, but big signings were what they were doing. They signed Pierre Engvall to a 7-year deal with the AAV of $3 million. They brought back Scott Mayfield on a 7-year deal with the AAV of $3.5 million. They brought back Semyon Varlamov on a 4-year deal with the AAV of $2.75 million. And then they brought in Ilya Sorokin on an 8-year contract extension. That extension will start at the beginning of next season with an AAV of $8.25 million. So first was the 3 signings that were in free agency. Bring back Engvall is solid. He was a really good player for them. I think he'd easily be a solid 3rd line forward for them. $3 million I think it might be a little bit expensive, but he's signed for the next few seasons, so that's really good for them. Mayfield's been a really good third-pair defenseman in the Islanders organization. Everyone really likes him there, so getting him locked up on a 7-year deal really does help that team. On top of that, the Islanders sounded like they really wanted to keep Varlamov, so they're able to keep him for the next 4 years. That's a little risky in my opinion, given the fact Varlamov is already 35 years old, but it's a solid signing for at least a backup goaltender. Sorokin's deal, that's a fantastic signing. We know that that extension will kick in next year. He's going to sign an $8.25 million deal, so that's a solid signing. Great to see him sign for under $9 million. I think he should be the Islanders starter for at least the next 5 to 6 years. So that's a really good signing for the Islanders. They bring back Sorokin on a contract extension that starts next year. They bring back Varlamov as his backup. They have Engvall, who should be a good middle 6 forward next year, and Mayfield, who should be a good 3rd-pair defenseman next year. So some really good signings there for the Islanders. Next one over with the Rangers, who did a ton on Free Agent Frenzy Day. On the forward group, they brought in Alex Belzile on a 2-year league minimum deal, Riley Nash on a 2-year league minimum deal. They also brought in Blake Wheeler, which was one of their bigger signings, on a 1-year deal with an AAV of $800,000. They brought in Nick Bonino on a 1-year, $800,000 deal, and then they brought in Tyler Pitlick on a 1-year deal with AV of $788,000. On the defensive end, they brought in Eric Gustafsson on a 1-year, $825,000 deal, Nicholas Broulard on a 1-year league minimum deal, and defenseman Connor Mackey on a 1-year league minimum deal, and they also brought in goalie Johnson Quick on a 1-year, $825,000 deal. So, in my opinion, those are some really good additions. Wheeler's the best addition they made on free agent friendly day one. They signed him to a 1-year, $80,000 deal. That's not an expensive deal, and Wheeler should be able to fit in the top six, maybe with a guy like Mika Zibanejad. So that's a solid addition for the Rangers. Bring in Wheeler, who should easily fill one of the holes left by Kane and Tarasenko. They also signed a couple of depth players. Pitlick, a good depth forward. Bonino, a good depth forward. Nash, a good depth forward. Belzile, a good depth forward. I could see all these guys possibly be starting the AHL next year. I could also see all of them have a shot at the fourth line role. So those are some really good additions there on the forward group for the Rangers. On the defensive end, Broulard most likely will be an AHL forward in my opinion. Could be called up if there's injuries, but I will say he would most likely be an AHL forward. Mackey, Gustafsson, both solid third pair defensemen. I could see either of them challenging for a solid third pair role with a guy like Braden Schneider on the defensive end. So those are some really good signings there for the Rangers. They also bring in Jonathan Quick, who is a solid backup goaltender for Vegas. Really lost his touch in LA this year, but I think could be a really good stellar backup behind Shesterkin next year. So those are some really good signings for the Rangers. Going over to the Philadelphia Flyers now. On their day one, they did bring in three key players, all in the forward group. They brought in Ray Gardner on a 2-year league minimum deal. They brought in Garnet Hathaway on a 2-year deal with AAV of $2.375 million. And they also brought in Ryan Poehling on a 1-year deal with AAV of $1.4 million. So they already have a solid hard-hitting forward in Nicolas Delorier, so they bring in some help there with Garnet Hathaway. They bring in Ray Gardner, who should be a good AHL forward, maybe get a call-up into the bottom six. But for the most part, I think it will be an AHL forward. Poehling should definitely be a good fourth, third-line forward for the Flyers as well on a 1-year deal. So some really good bottom six additions, as well as a depth addition in Gardner, and I think that's a really good deal for the Flyers on day one. For the Pittsburgh Penguins, they did a lot of good things on day one of free agent frenzy. On the forward group, they brought in Joni Kopanen on a 1-year league minimum deal. They brought in Lars Eller on a 1-year deal with AAV of $2.45 million. They brought in Noel Acciari on a 3-year deal with AAV of $2 million. And they brought in Matt Nieto on a 2-year deal with AAV of $900,000. On the defensive end, they brought in Ryan Graves on a 6-year deal with AAV of $4.5 million, as well as Ryan Shea on a 1-year league minimum deal. And on the goaltending side, they brought in Tristan Jarry on a 5-year deal with AAV of $5.375 million. As well as bringing in Alex Nedeljkovic on a 1-year deal with a $1.5 million AAV. So, in my opinion, those are some really good moves. Kopanen will most likely be an AHL player for the Penguins, maybe a call-up option, but most likely will be an AHL player. Meanwhile, Char, who's a solid fourth-line center, Eller, who's a solid third-line center, and Nieto, who's a good bottom six winger, should all be solid bottom six players for the Penguins. We know that the bottom six was a real problem last year, so Eller should be a good third-liner, while Nieto and Char should be good fourth-liners, and I think that really improves the Penguins' depth on the forward group. So some really good additions there. Shea on the defensive end should be an AHL defenseman. Could be a call-up, but once again, most likely an AHL defenseman. As for Graves, who basically replaces Dumoulin in the lineup, will be a solid top four defenseman for the Penguins, and I think that's a really good addition there. On the goaltending side, Jarry's back as being the starter. On a 5-year deal, he'll most likely remain as the starter, and Nedeljkovic is most likely going to be challenging Casey DeSmith for the backup role. One of those two will most likely be a third stringer in the AHL. One of those two will most likely be the backup. So, going to be interesting to see, but that helps them bring some more depth to challenge for DeSmith, and it also gets them a good starting goalie in Tristan Jarry. So some really good additions there. Starting goalie Jarry, and Nedeljkovic who could either be the second or third stringer. Graves, who could be a good top four defenseman. Shea, some depth on the defensive end. Kopanen, some depth on the offensive end. And then they also bring in some bottom six forwards in Nieto, as well as Eller, as well as Acciari. So some really good additions there for the Penguins on day one of free agent frenzy. And then lastly here with the Washington Capitals, they did a couple of depth moves. They signed Pierre Dubé to a entry-level contract, 2 years, $870,000. So once again, good entry-level contract for a forward. They signed Hunter Shepard to a 2-year deal, league minimum deal. So that's a good goalie addition. And on the forward group, they also added Max Pacioretty on a 1-year, $2 million deal. So in my opinion, those are some really good additions. Shepard's a really good, maybe third or fourth string goalie, and should replace one of their guys they lost in free agency. Dubé should continue to be a good player, continue to grow his game after signing his entry-level contract, so don't expect too much from him next year. Pacioretty should definitely be improving their middle six, and I think could definitely be a good second or third line forward, depending on how healthy he is. So, in my opinion, that's a really good move for the Capitals on the first day of free agent frenzy. So, definitely have to hear your thoughts on all the signings that have happened here. That's all the signings for the Eastern Conference on day one of free agent frenzy. Love to hear your thoughts. Which team did the best? Which signing do you think was the best for the Eastern Conference teams? Which signing do you think was the worst for the Eastern Conference teams? And which team do you think did worse on day one of free agent frenzy? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments and let me know of all the guys who signed free agency with the Eastern Conference. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video if you really liked it. Remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, stuff like that. So I'll leave a link to that in the description below as well. And can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.